Hello.
Luke, are you there?
Hello. Welcome.
Luke,
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, sir. How are you?
Yes, very well, very well. Yeah, how's it there in Tennessee?
Um, it is warm as all get out, as we say around here.
Right.
I would say right now it's probably around today has probably been about 70 degrees Fahrenheit here.
Okay.
In Celsius, I guess that would be what about 30 degrees Celsius for you Brits.
Yeah.
How is it in dear old England?
Rainy and grey as usual, as is generally the case around this time of year. But yeah, it's cool that you're in Tennessee. Actually, that's where broadly the area where my dad's family hail from originally.
Is that so? Is your dad American?
Yeah, so he was born in Florida, but his family come from sort of Missouri and North Carolina, and he just dug out a bunch of old uh, bits of ancestral records of, particularly from the Carter family, because we have a relationship to the Carter family of originally from Virginia, and
Right.
some of them I believe ended up around Tennessee as well. So yeah, it's a part of the world that I've never been to, I have to say, but it's a part of my ancestral homeland. So
Well, I can, just a little bit of anecdote about that. And I'll say about the Carters. This is just a little bit of Tennessee lore, specifically East Tennessee lore. And I am from East Tennessee in the Tri Cities area. And that would be like Bristol, Tennessee, Johnson City. Those are the two main cities, really. And Kingsport also. Those make up the Tri Cities.
mm,
And the Carter family, well, there's a lot of Carters around here. In fact, there's a Carter County, Tennessee, actually, which is, just about 30 minutes away from where I live. But also, the Carter family is a legendary family around here because they basically, I won't say invented bluegrass as we have it in Appalachia, but they popularized it and sent it to the mainstream basically in the 1930s. And there's a lot of lore about them, monuments to them, sort of public artifice to them. So the Carter family is a big deal, but there are a lot of Carters in and around Virginia and East Tennessee. So maybe you have some lineage to that, and that would be interesting. But you should definitely come here sometime if you ever get the chance. This is a beautiful state. East Tennessee, I'll say, is a beautiful part of the state, and Appalachia, Southern Appalachia in general, is it's a wonderful place. I'd never pick another place on earth to have as home. So I can't speak much better about it.
lovely. Yeah, I'd love to come visit someday. Yeah.
But yeah, if you ever do make it down this way, let me know, and I'd be happy to show and you and whoever else comes around. And I've actually had two of my best friends in college were English. They were from Birmingham, and
Mm,
they played on the soccer team at the university here.
right, right.
And they love this area, and they've come back to visit several times and kind of stayed up with me. And they just love this place so much.
Oh, cool. Yeah, sounds good, man. So yeah, I'm interested to hear a little bit about your general background and how you got to be interested in the history of Northern Europe.
Yes, sir. So I can tell you this. So really, how my interest started, which I've never really met anybody from a really small town, as I grew up in a small mountain town, who's kind of has the same background as me. But really what happened was I started reading voraciously very early on in my life. And there were a couple things that happened. One of those things was when The Lord of the Rings came out in 2001, I believe. the Fellowship of the Ring came out. I wasn't aware. I was a pretty young kid back then, but I was, in fact, I was still in grade school, kind of middling through grade school, very young. And I didn't know that they were books, and my dad told me that they were. And my dad and I would often have reading races. So we would both read the same book, and we would see who could finish it the fastest. And then, of course, we would quiz each other, right? And Lord of the Rings, he was coming out. He was very excited about it, and my dad's a school teacher, by the way, and he, put me to the test. So we tried to read. We raced reading the entire trilogy, and we had finished them before, a little bit after the Fellowship of the Ring came out, but we were seeing previews for the Two Towers, and we finished it, and I was just in love with that, and I recognized so many familiar concepts from Lord of the Rings, that ended up being, of course, based in, specifically British and English folklore, but some Scandinavian also, what with the dragons and other things of that nature. And that was a big deal. So that kind of set the groundwork for my interest in Northern European literature, Germanic literature. And in high school, I actually had an English teacher that was worth a damn. And we read Beowulf, and Beowulf basically altered my life. When we read Beowulf, it just completely changed the way that I thought. It changed my interests. It changed the trajectory I was kind of going on with poetry. I was interested in poetry at the time, but I had no idea which poets to read and so on and so forth. But Beowulf got me really interested in epic poetry and in ancient poetry. And so once I saw Beowulf, that was basically it. And when I got in college, and I decided I wanted to be an English major, which is a very perilous decision, by the way. I decided I wanted to do that, and I took a couple of Latin classes early on in college, and I was quite sharp with Latin, and I became really good friends with my Latin teacher, who was also the university's medievalist, and he specialized in Old English and Welsh, actually.
Hmm.
And so once I started talking to him, I basically took that trajectory, and that's what I studied and specialized in my entire academic career. So I did a lot of Old English early on, and just sort of high medieval period literature, studied Old English as a language. And then when I did my master's, that's when I started picking up Old Norse as a language, and ended up moving into Old Norse and Old Icelandic literature at that point. So that was kind of my trajectory in a very broad sense.
Mm. And I take it you were doing a PhD, or you were going to do a PhD at some point?
Yes, sir. So the PhD, it was sort of, I was doing I took a year off school, and I'm trying to recall some of this. As you know, we've been trying to do this podcast for for many days now, and I've just barely kind of held on this evening with some things coming up. So I'm trying to gather my thoughts. You have to forgive me for that. But
Yeah, of course.
what happened was, I took a year off school between my bachelor's and my master's, and that was probably around 2014, 2015. And I was firmly on the professor path. I wanted to be a professor. I was prepared to do the PhD. I knew what my master's thesis was going to be about, and I was pretty doggone sure I could carry that into a dissertation, and I was already doing that. And I was bringing in many different things. It was sort of, my master's thesis was a dual sort of treatise about Old Norse and Old English. I was using both languages in my work, and sort of comparing different poetry and things of that nature. I was ready to do it, and I did my master's, and in 2018, I really had to make the decision if I wanted to go on, and I didn't want to at that point, because there's a lot of things in my life happening. I wasn't ready to uproot and go somewhere. But also the political aspect in my university, but also just in general in the American university system. The political atmosphere started skewing very, very, very heavily left. And medievalism has sort of been a holdout against the progressive push in the university system here, but it's the walls are basically caved in at this point. And um I was going to panels and I was seeing the scholarship that was going on, and I was just kind of thinking, how the hell am I going to make it at some university where I'm a stranger basically? And I have to uproot my family. I'm going to be there for 6 years. I mean, how am I going to make it? And then after that, what is the chance that I'm going to get a decent job? Because in those sort of latter years at during my college career, I knew so many people who were getting turned down in the application process, and the sort of implication once you saw who the universities picked for their PhD programs and master's programs, it basically boiled down to they were white and Southern and were not, you know, their work was not with the program. And I to this day I have a good friend who has been trying to get into a university in Tennessee for his discipline. He's an English person also, and he's been rejected 3 times. I mean, he's published articles in academic journals. He's a published poet several times over. He's a young guy. He's real smart, but he never gets chosen for the university that he's trying to get into, and he has connections through professors that we know. So I basically had, to kind of cut my ramble here short, I basically had to make the decision. Do I want to really struggle and fight kind of for my life in academia and um, risk a lot of professional difficulty and ire? And then, even if I do get my PhD, basically risking, moving my family to some backwater part of a state where I can maybe get a lecturer position in a community college, because the odds are much more in the favor of that, rather than, having a bigger choice of university to go to. So I chose to go away from that path. So I've been working elsewhere for the last 2 years. I taught university as an adjunct and a lecturer around the tri-state area for about 3 or 4 years. I taught at 3 different universities. I teach 7 and 8 classes a semester, and that became unsustainable when my family was kind of up and coming. So now I'm doing other things. So that's basically the short of how I was faced with the choice of walking away from the PhD, and that's what I chose to do. I chose to walk away.
Yeah, I hear you there. I had a kind of very broadly similar trajectory myself, because I studied
Right.
studied English at university, and then a few years later decided to go back and try and get a doctorate. And I went through a few different proposals trying to get the money. I always got the place, but I just could never get the funding. And then eventually I was handing in these proposals, which are about looking into my great grandfather's writing. My great grandfather was J.B. Priestley, who was pretty well known in his time, and one of his plays is still on the syllabus of school children here in the UK.
Oh, excellent.
I could probably use this to get some traction, and kept trying. And even though J.B. Priestley was, in his time, he was a man of the left, and he helped the Labour Party to get elected after the end of the Second World War, but he wasn't the kind of leftist that the contemporary left like, because the as we've seen, the contemporary left have kind of drifted into some weird, bizarre mutation of what they used to be.
Drifted into to an abyss,
Yeah,
for lack of a better term, perhaps.
absolutely. Yeah, and digging themselves deeper into that, and eventually, I realized, in addition to just wasting my time trying to get these funding proposals done, the university environment was becoming increasingly ideologically narrow, and someone with heterodox ideas about various different things would find it very difficult to be vocal about those things. And yeah, so that was kind of where it stood. And it's interesting about the disciplines like medieval studies, Old Norse studies, and things like this, because, as you say, they've held out for a certain time, but they're starting to cave in, as you say. And this came up in our conversation that I had with Stone Age Herbalist a month or two back, about the wokeification of archaeology, which is a really interesting phenomenon. This is actually the point that we made contact on, was the existence of female warrior graves in Norse archaeology, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And we spoke on that, and I'll just speak to a couple points on the wokeification, because I know that herbalist is, British also, and you guys have some commonality in, I think, understanding what the political ambience is over there, and how the universities have been over there. And a conservative in Britain is obviously not the same as like a conservative in the United States, right? So things obviously are a little bit different in terms of atmosphere. But I will say this. So I think maybe what I meant to say by that was, you all have probably experienced the wokeification a lot earlier than we have over here. And especially being in a southern university, a southern public university, which is where I did most of my work at. um it There was sort of a more cultural bulwark against that. But the thing about that is that I saw it basically happen. People who were about 10 years older than me, maybe in their early to mid 40s, maybe even a little older than that. I often hear, especially on Twitter, people will talk about the wokeification in America kind of happening already in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And that might be true, but I would push back on that and say that I basically saw it happen at my university. And I basically experienced that just in all of the application processes, and looking into advancing education, and doing work at other universities, going to conferences, things of that nature, all around the Southeast United States. And what I noticed about that was, my medievalist professor is a good example of this. He was a good, probably a good 90s liberal, as far as American political terms are, valid in our talk. He, not certainly not like a rabid progressive, but a liberal in the sense that, he's very sort of passive about resisting ideas he finds abhorrent. So, there were many occasions where we would be talking about some really bogus scholarship, or in some cases we would be in conversation with someone, and he was always very hesitant to kind of forgive their zealotry, or forgive just the idiocy of their ideas. And he and I diverged, and he's a great friend to me still, but he and I diverged on this very often. I would say, Professor, like, surely we can't entertain this kind of garbage, because that's what it is, garbage. And he would agree, but he would say, well, all scholarship is valid, that kind of mentality. And that was going on really in 2012, 2013. And by the time 2015 rolled around, I was going to many conferences. I was reading a lot of papers. I was reading papers for different things. I was reading medieval papers. I was reading poetry papers. I was going to creative writing conferences and things of that nature. It was a really busy travel year, and it was 2015 that about every conference I would go to, when I was driving back home, I would reflect and just think, what the hell did I listen to on some of these panels, right? Like, I can't believe that not only the scholarship is passing, but also just the personalities of the readers, of the scholars, because we would go into these panels, you'd hear these very benign, very productive papers, some very boring papers, some very good ones, the basic flow, but more and more of these just very aggressive, very progressive minded readers would come on and just antagonize the audience, or would be antagonized by questions, very benign questions. And I just feel like 2015 for me was when that happened. And that's when I began to really have doubts about my future, and what, the cost benefit analysis of what working in this environment would be, because I knew that the chances were that any university I would end up doing my doctoral work in, or whatever the case may be, I knew it would not be a benign department like I had been working in at my university. And I just couldn't believe some of the things that I was hearing and seeing, and I tell people all the time, looking back at that year, at maybe 2014, 2015, looking back now and considering how things have transpired politically and culturally, I realize now we were all looking into the abyss, right? We just didn't know it. We didn't know that those people giving those papers and doing that absurd scholarship, we had no idea that they were all about to be hired on as HR people, as advertising people, as publishing people, as professors, and guidance counselors and things of that nature. We just had no idea we were looking into the abyss. And aside, my classes at that time, in my university, and this is when I was getting very deep into my language studies and also into my literary studies. More and more, we were having undergrads come up in classes who would show up in grad classes, who were just completely averse to the very basic spirit of poems like Beowulf, of poems like The Wanderer, of poems, even higher medieval poems, things like Canterbury Tales, things like that. And I was starting to get into very vicious debates with people at that time in class, and I knew things were changing at that point, and they have continued to change that way. So I don't know if I've diverted from my original point, but it's really professors, I think, sort of Gen X age professors like my medievalist who mean well, who sort of possess a liberalism of maybe 20, 30 years ago, and they've basically allowed this to happen. The ones, because they don't actually buy the politics behind their own doors. They don't buy the scholarship in their own offices, but they've allowed it to happen, and the cat's out of the bag now. So that, I think that was my point about my professor.
I remember Camille Paglia made this point that the postmodernization of the universities occurred at the same time and in tandem with the bureaucratization of the universities, and that the professors should have been resisting it from the get-go and stopping this process. But as it happens, from the 80s and 90s, and my parents also work in academia, semi-retired, mostly retired now, but they saw this process happening as well. And the
Yeah,
postmodern.
yeah, exactly. And I think that the dominoes falling, and again, I really do think the American South is still behind in the wokeification process. Maybe less and less every year, maybe perhaps every month, but I still think it's a holdout. But that kind of thing has allowed the bogus scholarship and the bogus claims. Like you said, we were talking about the grave goods, the female grave goods, and I'll get back to that point, and sort of back to my anecdote of how things began to transpire in the class. So, you know, academia has allowed itself to be so politically manipulated that not only is it impossible to basically make a critique um, of spurious claims or baseless claims, or basically just, I mean, bogus claims of, like the female gray goods, which they are. They're sort of the female grave goods thing is really a lie of omission, right? And I'll get to that in a minute. But academia has made it impossible to critique those things in an academic standpoint, but it's also made it impossible to continue to do actual real scholarship, right? And do the work and have the funding that requires, that real scholarship requires. And so what you have is you have a bunch of really of basically intellectual half pints who come up, and they're what they say they're medievalists, they're working in medieval literature, they're working in classical literature, they're doing these things, but what they really are, they're gender studies people, and that's the only lens that they see everything through. They have a very narrow view. And the female grave goods thing, really, I think, has contributed to the really, in my opinion, harmful but also very boring portrayal of Vikings in culture in the last 10 to 15 years, because the female the female grave goods that are found with weapons and found with, you might say, more masculine implements in grave goods, we've never had any conclusive evidence as to why the women were buried with those things, as many archaeological things go, male or female. Because sometimes, if you look back even further in the Bronze Age, males males are sometimes buried with more like feminine implements, not feminine dress typically, but what you might consider more passive or domestic implements or tools rather than weapons. And so you see this kind of blurring of the lines a lot in archaeology, and we can never really get a truly definitive answer for it. But the shield maiden idea and the female Viking idea is so alluring, because what it does, it's so easy to paste um, the modern idea of the female onto that female corpse in the grave that might be buried with weapons, or might be buried with a horse, might be buried with a shield. And so you get all these articles coming out, and you read the headline, which makes it sound definitive that this was a warrior woman, right? But you read into the article, and it's, basically a bunch of guessing and a bunch of half truths and lies of omission. And the lies of omission are always against the whole context of archaeology, or against the whole cultural context of these things. So you get that. But what archaeology like that, which is wokeified to some extent, has allowed Vikings to become wokeified in a way that I really never thought possible, right? And I'm talking about the Vikings TV show, but I'm also talking about, video games and other things like that. And you have a whole population of people who just think that um, half of a Viking raiding party of maybe 80 or 90 men, a third of them or a half of them are women. warrior women, which is just absolutely not true, and not realistic in any fashion, right? So there are things we can talk about with that, but it's that baseline archaeology, but through that gender lens, that has allowed this to happen, right? Because the modern person who is subsumed by media and subsumed by, echo chambers and propaganda, essentially has the memory of a goldfish. So it's very easy to convince the average sort of Vikings interested person that a full half of a Viking army could be women or something like that. So,
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it also uncovers a set of contradictions within the ideological matrix of the wokified mindset itself. Because it's like, on one hand, being a warrior is obviously bad, and violence is bad, and it's all about kind of finding peaceful solutions. But also, women were warriors, and that was really badass, and they were like totally badass, just like the men. And you go, hang on, well, you can't have both of those ideas existing. You have to choose one or the other, and
right.
it's like, yeah, that is an interesting kind of, there's a set of dichotomies that are never quite resolved, because ultimately it's about undermining. I'm just kind of riffing here, that it seems to me more about undermining than actually providing something coherent in its place. Because to be interested in medieval North European history is kind of considered a little bit suspect anyway. It's like,
Yes.
you're a little bit on the edge. So to make it acceptable, you have to kind of prove that they're all gay or trans or women or whatever the thing is, the identity category that you use to make it sort of okay. And yet it's still, Tolkien is a terrible racist who wrote reactionary, conservative bigotry, but also Frodo and Samwise were obviously queer. And this kind of, none of it really makes sense, but it works to undermine some sort of patriarchal bogeyman that these people have in their heads.
Yeah, yes. And to get to your first point about, the left claims to want peaceful solutions, and they claim that patriarchal, or not patriarchal, but masculine virtue is inherently violence, and that the role of the warrior is patriarchal and masculine, therefore it is violent and bad and backwards. But you have to understand that the warrior woman is so alluring because the left also generally secretly believes, and not so secretly, believes anymore, that violence is actually okay if the people we approve do it, right? If the people we approve do the violence, then the violence is righteous. And this is obviously an old idea that anybody learned in history can understand and see happening now, in media race, right? But that is the thing, and the left loves to fetishize, who they see as, minorities or see as disadvantaged people. They love to fetishize their virtue and and turn them into either messiahs or doers of violence, right? You see this a lot. And it is nonsensical. It is paradoxical in nature, because it comes from a place of, in my opinion, absolute philosophical and spiritual decrepitude and opportunism, right? Because if you boil everything down to, even the people who have turned academia on their heads, there are far more people who have, secretly, been against progressive ideology and progressive scholarship and discursive scholarship who just want to keep their jobs but don't buy any of it, right? And it's very easy to be passive in that fashion. So I think there are far more of those people than sort of active, willing progressives who want to distort academia and distort the way we see literature.
Mm.
But as far as the sort of the northern literature and the northern Germanic literature, I think it's a real crime. And I would like to talk about Tolkien as well, but I think it's a real crime that the warrior woman, which is not a false idea, there are exceptions in the literature, and I'll even say that there are probably exceptions in the archaeology. I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't have a really great place of reference, in my memory for that. But I do know of some exceptions where there are exceptions where women have had to take up arms, especially in Germanic literature.
Mm.
Women have done acts of violence that have great consequence, and they're capable of that. And a couple examples of that would be, I think to the Icelandic sagas, and one woman that I think is a woman of great consequence is Gisli's wife in Gisli's saga. And Gisli's saga is one of the outlaw sagas, right? So Gisli is sort of a good man, and through some very bad circumstances and through fate, he becomes an outlaw and he becomes hunted in Iceland. And it's a rather short saga, and I'd highly recommend it to people. But he has to hide out. I won't go through the whole thing, but he has to basically hide out. And his wife, who is a very noble and faithful woman and a good woman, she has a room for him to stay in the basement. She puts him up, she gives him food, and things go awry. And in the climax of the saga, Gisli finds himself having a last stand up on a mountain, basically on a slope, and he's being attacked from all sides by men, and he is defending himself valiantly. And though he is an outlaw legally, and this gets to the sort of constant complication of Icelandic legalism in this time, he's been made an outlaw, but sort of wrongfully, and most people know it, right? Most people know that he is a good man, but he has some people who are after him who have his number, and they're not well liked. They're not good people. And so he's having this last stand. He's being hunted down by this band of sort of miscreants. And his wife comes to the place of the last stand, and he the main man who is trying to kill Gisli and take his head, she tries to basically he tries to compensate his wife for Gisli's death, because he knows that Gisli is a well-liked man, and so is his wife, and he's trying to sort of keep the peace but still take the outlaw out, basically. And he tries to buy off Gisli's wife with money. He has a pouch of silver coins, right? And there's this really powerful scene where he tries to hand the coins to Gisli's wife. She takes the coins, she looks at them, balls the coins up in her fist, and utterly punches him in the face, right? She completely cleans his clock and bloodies his face. And even though all of the action is going on around, trying to kill Gisli, the men who are around this and see this immediately know what they're doing is wrong, right? Because of the reaction of this woman and the strength of her reaction. And of course, they don't do anything to her because it's illegal to harm a woman, right? At this time in the law codes of the 9th and 10th centuries, I should say the 10th and 11th centuries, it's illegal to harm a woman, and it's looked at badly. Not so much different than today. But she has this immense strength about her when she does this, right? And she doesn't have to be a warrior to do this. And this is a common trait of many women in the sagas that as we have them, right? You don't see many of the main women in the tales, running out to grab shields and swords very often, but they have incredible strength of will. They have incredible strength of cunning and intelligence, and they command the respect of many, many strong men, right? And to just cast these very complex, charismatic, and strong female characters off as warriors, who just go into battle to kill men, right? Essentially, that is the job of a warrior. It is to be a killer of men. It really just shows a lack of vigorous reading of the sagas, and it shows a disrespect of the aspects of womanhood and femininity that these Norse characters specifically possess, right? And Gisli's wife is just one example of those. It's much harder to write a Gisli's wife in a Viking show rather than just a Viking warrior woman, right? So that would be what I would say to that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the way in which a strong woman, quote in quotation marks, is portrayed in kind of contemporary media. Uh, as you say, it's such a simplistic and naive image that appeals to a selection of different temperaments, one of which is obviously the kind of ideologically driven feminist idea that for a woman to be worthy of respect, she has to effectively compete with men at their own game and win every time, which is it's actually quite a another paradox in itself, because you're saying that, well, the kinds of roles that women have played in society aren't even worth considering as
Right.
worthy of respect. So there's a contradiction there, but also there's a certain kind of male temperament that seems to fetishize that sort of, cartoonish Lara Croft kind of high kicking ball breaker woman. So there's a certain kind of element of fetishism going on as well. But the reality, as you say, the reality that is depicted in the literature is so much more interesting, and shows women actually using their own unique positions in society, their own unique strengths, to great effect.
Yeah, yes, and I would say, and I'll add this to my Icelandic example. I want to add an Old English example that I think would be, fairly familiar to many listeners who have read Beowulf, of course, but another character that is, and Beowulf being a far older poem than the Icelandic sagas, and a far older story. The character of Wealhtheow, who is the queen of Heorot, who is Hrothgar's wife and queen. And, one of my favorite parts about Beowulf is the whole scene where they're all in the mead hall together. Unferth has been humbled by Beowulf's quipping, and, he's had the piss taken out of him. And they're sitting down, and they're all, in the mead hall. And for some reason in my mind right now, I believe this is before Beowulf's fight with Grendel. I think it might actually be after Grendel is killed and they're going to the marsh to find Grendel's mother. I've read that poem so many times, but for some reason I can't get that straight right now. But in any case, when they're in the mead hall and the poet is specifically painting, a very Anglo-Saxon scene, right? So everybody's at the mead benches, the swords are on the laps, the corselets are hung up on the wall. The king is at the head of the table, and they're about to feast. And Wealhtheow is, of course, the cupbearer. So she is taking round the cup to all the warriors. They're taking the first drink of the cup, as it were. And Wealhtheow is doing so many things in that scene. And the poet is a little bit less obvious. It's a little bit more of an archaic poem. It's got a lot of subtext to it that I think would only be obvious in performance to an Anglo-Saxon audience of maybe the 7th or the 6th, 7th, or 8th centuries, and maybe even farther than that. But those centuries especially, the Anglo-Saxon audience would know the significance of Wealhtheow, and how she's being described and what she's doing and what she's saying. And what she's doing is that when she talks to Beowulf, she's just kind of asking him questions. She's, kind of making him not swear oaths, but she is forcing him to respond to her in etiquette. And what she's really doing is she's making sure that Beowulf, and I don't have the poem on me, but she is making sure that Beowulf is not going to run off, do these heroic deeds, and then come back and basically depose Hrothgar, right? And she's asking him these questions in a very tactfully way. And the subtext of that poem is that Wealhtheow knows everything that's going on. She knows Hrothgar's desperation. She understands the direness of the situation of Heorot and the kingdom at large. And she also understands the kind of man that Beowulf is and the kind of man that he might be, right? Because you live in the realities of, migration period, northern Scandinavia and the North Sea region in general, in which, at the drop of a hat, the political situation can change. A strong man can depose an old king, can become a tyrant, and plunge the kingdom from a place of productivity and peace into a place of feud and war and loss, right? So she knows that Beowulf is a strong man. She understands his charisma, she understands his strength, and she understands his reputation. And so that whole scene with them, where she is asking him questions and talking to him while she has the cup, she's kind of testing him. She's getting his word. She's getting his proof that he's not going to come back and take out Hrothgar, right? She wants her sons to be able to rise after Hrothgar, right? And she's doing her duty as queen by ensuring that her sons will take the mantle of king after Hrothgar dies, right? And so she understands that Beowulf is the solution to the problem, but she's also holding him to account, right? And she has a lot of power in that scene and a lot of power in her character that is maybe lost on a modern audience. And but she is a fulcrum in that scene and really around the whole story. So she's an older example, but there's so many women in the canon and in the whole collection of Northern Germanic literature that command intense respect of the men and command intense power over the actions of men and the actions of the minds of others and the fate of others. And this is why women are often magical in nature, because their influence is such that it might as well be magic without them casting spells, because they run the show, right? When the men are out fighting and going a Viking, going raiding, or doing whatever they have to do as warriors, it's women running the farmstead. It's women doing the finances. It's women ordering the thralls and ordering the craftsmen. It's women doing all of these things. And society doesn't function if you send Wealhtheow or Gilsley's wife out on a Viking ship to get killed in a shield wall, right? But again, it's down to a matter of writing, and it's down to the basis denominator of imagination. It's much easier to write a woman who acts like a man rather than a woman who not only acts like a woman but commands great power as that woman, right? So that would be my point about Wealhtheow.
Interesting. Yeah. I saw some fascinating content from your Twitter account recently about the bear cult in Northern Europe. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So the bear cult is yeah, it took me a long time to go through that. And it's still always in my mind, but I'm trying to work through Grettir's saga right now, and I've been waylaid at every turn, trying to write my next part of that series. But the bear cult is interesting because um, and there's a lot of people, Stone Age herbalist foremost among them, who could talk better about the archaeological and anthropological nature and existence of sort of a transcontinental bear cult that exists in ancient humanity, and it's expressed in different ways in different cultures. But I basically wanted to talk about the memory, the echoes of the bear cult, as it may have been, as some of it may have been, as they exist in Northern Germanic literature. And by that I just mean the Icelandic sagas, Anglo-Saxon literature, and I'm sure it's elsewhere too. But that's just the stuff that I know best, and it's the stuff that I can talk about. So the idea of the bear warrior is very old, and it's as old as basically as humanity as we know it, and even further back. And in Northern Germanic literature, the bear warrior is, I think, the mitigator between the idea of the shaman and the idea of the warrior king. And so there's something about, I think, the totemic idea of the bear, right? We have to start there, in the sense that um, the bear is a very human animal, right? And this goes back in many different traditions and many different cultures. But the bear is significant not because of just its strength, not just because of its savviness in the forest, the inherent danger of the bear, but it's the humanness of the bear that makes it a very totemic animal. A bear is very smart. It has very human eyes. It has very human movements. It commands the same kind of diet as a human. A bear can eat anything. A bear can choose to eat, grubs, fruits, and vegetables. It can choose to hunt. For instance, the black bears that are very um, proliferous around where I live in East Tennessee and Southern Appalachia, they are typically omnivorous. But if times get hard, it's not uncommon to hear about a bear chasing down a horse or a deer. People will tell stories about a black bear eating a deer on the side of the road, or maybe a calf. And they don't often do that. They're typically herbivorous, but they will occasionally hunt down large animals to eat meat. Um, and so they occupy the same domain as man does. They occupy the same ancient boundaries that man does, whether it be the cave versus the open plain, or the forest versus the sort of ensconced village, right? The bears sort of know how to negotiate the same kind of territory. So there's some deep totemic idea of the bear that man over time has come to see in himself and of himself. And in terms of the bear warrior of Germania, um, so to speak, the bear warrior occupies the place of the sort of other world, or the animal world. He has one foot in the other world and one foot in the real world, right? He has one foot in the sort of instinct and existence and secret knowledge of the animal, and one foot in the politics and power of the warrior, right? So the bear warrior has a lot of importance in the literature of northern Europe and Germania, in the sense that the bear warrior is either an emissary of the king or is the king himself, and there's always a shamanic ordeal that the bear warrior must go through. And so in that thread, I sort of made a continuum from sort of what I see as a much older poem in Hrolf Kraki's saga, which is a migration period saga. The action of it probably takes place ideally in the fourth or fifth century in northern Europe, or lower Scandinavia. It talks about the Geats, the Swedes, the same kind of area that Beowulf is located in. And I trace that idea of that warrior archetype all the way up to the Icelandic sagas. And the whole idea is that the memory of that shamanic bear warrior runs so deep that the memory of it is still visceral in the times of what you might say modern medieval writing and modern medieval storytelling. Or I might, I think modern is probably a good way to describe it. But the idea of that bear warrior is so deeply entrenched in the storytelling, but also the virtue of the Germanic warrior and the imagination of the Germanic warrior and the Germanic person, right? So, I'll say this too before I kind of turn that over, but like it's you have different characters in the sense of like Hrolf Kraki's saga. You have Bodvar, Bodvar Bjarki, whose name literally means like bear, right? he's a double bear. He's a battle bear. And he undergoes a complete shamanic initiation in his life. He's born from a woman who basically mates with a werebear, a man who is cursed to be a bear. He turns into a bear, I believe during the day. And yeah, he turns into a bear during the day. So she spends her nights with him once they meet. And Bodvar is born of this union, and he has a brother who's basically a goat man, Elf Frodi. The top half is human, the bottom half is an elk, and he is a shaman. And he kind of tests Bodvar. He puts Bodvar through an ordeal. Bodvar is very strong, but he goes through this ordeal with Frodi, and he sort of begins his life as a warrior, but he's really on a shamanic initiation journey. And eventually he undergoes ordeals. He meets up with Hrolf Kraki, becomes his greatest warrior and confidant. And the climax of that poem, it's not really clear. He might shapeshift. I think he actually casts a spell, or he astrally projects himself as a bear who fights alongside Hrolf Kraki in the sort of ultimate battle of the poem, because he's awakened by a trance, and the bear disappears later. So the poem is a little inconsistent about that. Not inconsistent, but the translation is a little bit hard to parse, perhaps. But so he is basically a shaman. And so the trajectory of that up through the next few hundred years, you have Beowulf, who is a bear warrior. He has the strength of a bear. He's the confidant and main warrior of a king. His name means Beowulf, which is an Anglo-Saxon kinning that means bear, right? Because what is a wolf to bees? Well, that would be a bear who breaks into the hives and hunts the bees. And so you have that up to the outlaw, I think, Grettir Asmundarson, who has all of those things without the name of bear. He's a wanderer. He's an outlaw. He is on the periphery of society. He's a confidant of strong men. It's his job to destroy undead, to destroy trolls, to solve problems. But he's a little too strong for his own good, and he kind of bites off more than he can chew. But he occupies that same space that Beowulf does, that Bodvar Bjarki does, right? So the idea of the bear warrior is very interesting, because it's sort of an eternal idea as far as many places are concerned, but I think especially Northern Europe. And so, and I'll add this to Luke while I'm kind of rambling on here. As someone who has had a lot of experience with bears, just growing up where I did on the farm, where I did tracking bears, seeing bears, running around apple trees and various places, in the woods, on the farm, but also encountering them, out while hiking for 5 or 6 days at a time on the AT. Um, bears are bears are very human-like. They're very smart. They're very subtle. They have an intelligence about them that no other animal does. Um, that you can obviously observe if you're experienced while hiking. So that idea is still there if you have the raw experience to kind of see it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, there is something very numinous about the bear, which it makes me think actually of the bear obsession of the guy in Werner Herzog's documentary Grizzly Man.
Yes.
Where it just the his kind of captivation with them just led to his uh, ludicrous demise. It's
Yes.
really really sad and tragic, tragicomic story, I have to say. But yeah, but his inability to understand the true power of the bear, because he belittled them and turned them into Disney-fied versions of the same thing.
Yes, and that is the crux of the bear warrior, is that the berserker cult, especially, I think, echoes this. The berserker cult as we know it now, from the sagas, from other sort of scant part pieces of literature. The berserker cult, which was certainly probably most definitely a religious Odinic cult of some sort. The berserker cult is really a sort of a terminus of bear worship and the idea of the bear warrior in general, right? The berserker cult is sort of, as we see it, is a sort of religious institution, and in some cases a fallen religious institution where the berserker cults are formally outlawed and scattered, and the berserkers are just running around kind of tormenting people, and they're out of place. Their usefulness has been outlasted. And so we get this vague idea of a warrior culture that based itself on the fury and on the cunning and intelligence of the bear, that obviously existed, before writing, before even sort of oral documentation that we can know or see that exists still in writing. And that's the thing about the bear, is that the bear is sort of the totem of the warrior, because the bear is the warrior personified. The bear can have moments of great intelligence and lucidity and gentility, but at any moment, rather, whether it be unprompted or prompted, the bear turns into a monster that can, literally kill you in seconds if it gets you the right way, right? And that is the idea of, I think, of the warrior as we get it in Northern Germanic literature. You often have gnomic poetry or wisdom poetry, as more as it's more commonly known, where the warrior is described as someone who has great discretion, someone who has great personal discipline, someone who stays quiet, someone who doesn't boast, but someone who has the capability to fight to the death without fear of death at the highest rate of ferocity as possible when battle arises, right? And that's kind of what the bear is, because again, as somebody who's experienced bears, actual wild bears, not the ones that are fed with hamburgers in the Great Smoky Mountains, who are the most dangerous bears, by the way. They most times you see them, they're sort of bumbling, funny creatures, right? A lot of times if you're making noise out there, they're already running away from you by the time you even know that they're there. But by chance that that's not happening, they they're kind of bumbling around. They seem even a little bit clumsy. They have an air of just kind of gentility even around them. But the moment that you provoke them, the moment that you kind of impinge on their activity or their agenda, they immediately can dispatch you in seconds,
Mm.
right? And that's kind of the idea of the warrior. It's the man who has the capability to withhold himself and be gentle, but also when it's time for violence, the man who has he is not infringed on his ability to kill other men efficiently, quickly, and brutally, right? Without fear of death. And that's what the bear is, right? That's what the bear is. And if you've ever hunted bear, which I've been on a bear hunt, but I've never killed a bear myself. Bears fight to the last. They get their back against the wall, and they do not relent against dogs, against a hunter. They fight like the Thane is supposed to fight. He's supposed to make his last stand and fight to the death at all costs. And that is that Germanic idea, right? The Thane is the warrior. And by the way, I had a space on the Wanderer where we read the Wanderer aloud in Old English and we discussed it. And I told people that one of the words that the Anglo-Saxon use for warrior in that poem is Beorn, which just means bear, right? That's obviously a sister word of the Old Norse bear. And that's just used to describe a general warrior, right? Because the ideal warrior has his back against the wall and he fights until he is utterly exhausted and spent and is killed, right? And that's what the bear does. That's the behavior of the bear. So the bear is kind of a bridge between humanity and the violence and unknowable spirit of nature. Yeah.
Fascinating. What do you think the role of the wolf cult is in contrast to the bear cult? Because there's also the hint of that with the werewolf idea and the Ulfhednar and that sort of thing.
So I don't know. That's a really good question, and one that I think somebody more learned than me could probably answer. But my answer would be this: is that the Ulfhednar get a lot of press because I think the werewolf is incredibly well known. The idea of the werewolf, the man wolf, and the idea of the wolf warrior is has somehow sort of like risen to this contemporary prominence. And I don't exactly know when that started or how that started. It could have started even with Wagner. I don't know where he brings the Volsung saga back. But the literature on the Ulfhednar is kind of sparse, I think, in a fashion, because they show up in some very early mythical sagas. They show up in the Volsung saga. They show up in a couple other places, but they don't really have. I think the presence of the bear is much stronger, even linguistically, definitely, but maybe not as so much as mythically, but linguistically, the spirit of the bear warrior is far more prominent than that of the wolf warrior. And the reason is, I think, is because the wolf doesn't have the same connotation that modern people give it, right? We live in a world that is sadly very bereft of the wolf, at least in the West, right? We have some wolves, we have refuges and sanctuaries for wolves over here, some wild, some captivity kind of situations. There's even a wolf reserve in Kingsport, Tennessee, at a place called Bays Mountain. There's actually a pretty large wolf reserve there. But we live in a world that has conquered the wolf, that has driven the wolf into the shadows. And so I think modern people see the wolf and they see the myth of the werewolf and the fury of the werewolf and the sort of horror and otherness of it, sort of contrasted with the kind of nobility that we see in the wolf, because we live in a world where we don't have to fight wolves. We don't have to hunt wolves to keep them from killing our livestock. We don't live in a world where if the average person loses one or two cows, if you lose a couple of cattle, your family could be ruined for years, right? And that was the world of the wolf. And the world of the wolf, when they were proliferous, when they were everywhere, the wolf was the symbol of death. The wolf was the symbol of gluttony. The wolf was a symbol of ravening hunger and killing. And the Ulfhednar, they are often pictured in that fashion. So in the Volsung saga, when the two guys, famously, they put on their wolf skins, they put on their magic wolf skins, and they turn into wolves, and they just they go ravening through the countryside. They are not sort of like noble warriors. They are vehicles of death and destruction, right? And the wolf is the sort of blunt instrument of death, whereas the raven is kind of the portender and wisdom of death, because the wolf and the raven are the two great symbols of death in Northern Germanic literature, and certainly in that world. They represent a couple different sides of death, of course, but the wolf is a glutton. The wolf is death and destruction incarnate. The wolf is symbolic with the outlaw, with the ne'er-do-well, with the murderer, with the thief. And so the wolf cult, I think, I don't know if there is a wolf cult. There may have been, there might be. I've never like looked too deeply into it, but the berserker cult, as we have them, I mean, they likely had rituals based around the wolf, but the berserker cult, I think, is a remnant, certainly, of the bear warrior and the totemic bear, the bear person, right? And I don't know. I think the Ulfhednar and the wolf cult in general gets they get some more press because we see the wolf in a different way in the contemporary world, because the wolf is tinged now with nostalgia and nobility, whereas 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, the wolf would have meant a very different thing to the average person living in Europe or even in the United States. So that's my answer to that.
Fascinating. Well, it's been great talking to you today, sir. And where can we find your material online?
Well, right now I'm just I'm confined on Twitter. So anytime I do any kind of writing or posting or just any kind of discussion, you can always find me on Twitter, and my handle is Ancient Days 1, and you can just search Ancient Days and you should find me crop up. My avatar is it looks like a manuscript illumination. It's Ael Skallagrimson, who is a crazy saga warrior, and you can find my stuff there. And yeah, that's where you can look me up. I'm trying to write more on there. I'm trying to get a bigger presence on there and just continue putting out saga material, putting out old English material, and just trying to give that to people and trying to show that to people. That's my main goal. So
Brilliant. Well, thanks for joining me today, and you have a great new year.
hey, Luke, thank you too, and I appreciate you being patient with me trying to schedule this. And I hope we get the chance to do it again sometime. I've really enjoyed this, and you have a great new year as well.
Definitely. Yeah, let's catch up again. Take care. All the best.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Bye-bye.